Near the sheep pens, she stopped to wipe the sweat from her forehead. Her bucket was lighter now and no trouble to hold with one hand. She eyed the nearest dog cautiously. Standing in front of one of the pens, it was a large animal with close, curly gray coat and intelligent eyes that seemed to know that she was no danger to the sheep. Still, it was very big, almost waist high to a grown man. Mainly the dogs helped protect the flocks when they were in the pasture, guarding against wolves and bears and the big mountain cats. She edged away from the dog. 3 boys passed her, herding a few dozen sheep toward the river, all 5 or 6 years older than she. The boys barely gave her a glance, their full attention on the animal. The herding was easy enough. She could have done it, she was sure, but they had to make sure none of the sheep had a chance to crop grass. A sheep that ate before being sheared could get the gasping and die. A quick look around told her that none of the other boys in sight was anyone she wanted to speak to. Not that she was looking for a particular boy to speak to, of course, she was just looking. Anyway, her bucket would need refilling soon. It was time to start back toward the wine spring water. This time she decided to go by the way of row of trestle tables. The smells were tantalizing, as good as any feast day, everything from roast goose to honey cakes. The spicy aroma of the honey cakes filled her nose more than all the rest. Every woman who cooked would have done her very best for the sharing. As she made her way down the tables, she offered water to the women setting out food, but they just smiled at her and shook their heads. She kept on, though. And not just because of the smells. They had tea water boiling on fires behind the tables, but some of them might want cool water from the river. Well, not so cool now, but still. Ahead of her, Kenley was slouching along beside the tables, no longer trying for every inch of height. If anything, he seemed to be trying for shorter. He still carried his bucket in one hand, but from the way it swung, it must have been empty, so he could not be offering water to anyone. Egwin frowned. Furtive was the only word to describe him. Now, what was he? Abruptly, his hand darted out, and he snatched a honey cake from the table. Egwin's mouth fell open indignantly. And he had the nerve to talk to her about children? He was as bad as Edwin Feinger. Before Kenley could take a second step, Mistress Elaine descended on him like a stooping falcon, seizing his ear with one hand and the honey cake with the other. They were her honey cakes, a slim woman with thick gray braid that hung below her hips. Corin Ellion baked the best sweets in Edmondsfield, except for her mother. Egwin added loyally, but even her mother said Mistress Aylin was better with sweets anyways. Mistress Aylin handed out crusty cakes and slices of pie with a free hand, so long as it was not near her meal time, or your mother had not asked her not to. But she could deal heavily with boys who tried to filch behind her back, or with anyone else stealing, she called it. And Mistress Ellen did not abide stealing. She still had Kenley by his ear and was shaking a finger at him. Talking in a low voice, Kenley's face was all twisted up as if he was about to cry, and he shrank in on himself till he appeared shorter than Egwin. She gave a satisfied nod. She did not think he would try to give orders to anyone anytime soon. She moved further from the tables as she walked on by Mistress Ellion and Kenley, so no one would suspect her of trying to filch sweets. She thought she had never entered her head. Not really, anyways. Not so it counted. Suddenly she leaned forward, peering between the people moving back and forth in front of her. Yes, that was Perrin Asbra, a stocky boy taller than most his age, and he was a friend of Rand. She darted through the crowd without noticing whether anyone motioned for water. It did not stop until she was only a few paces from Perrin. He was with his parents, and his mother had the baby, Patrum, on her hip, and little Dessel clinging to her skirt with one hand. Though Perrin's little sister was looking around with interest at all the people, even sheep being herded past, Adora, his other sister, stood with her arms folded across her chest in a sullen expression, that she was trying to hide from her mother. Adora would not have to carry water until next year, and she was probably anxious to be off playing with her friends. The last person in the little group was Master Lewin, the tallest man of Edenfield, with arms like tree trunks and a chest that strained his white shirt. He made Master Ibarra look slight instead of just slender. He was talking with Mistress Ibarra and Master Ibarra both. That puzzled Egwin. Master Lewin was the blacksmith in Edmondsfield, but neither Master Ibarra nor Mistress Abra would bring the whole family to ask after smithing. He was on the village council too, but the same thing applied. Besides, Mistress Ibarra would no sooner open her mouth about council business than Master Ibarra would about women's circle business. Egwin might only be 9, but she knew that much. Whatever they were talking about, they were almost done, and that was good. She did not care what they were talking about. He's a good lad, Jocelyn, Master Luhan. A good lad, Con. He'll do just fine. Mrs. Ibarra smiled fondly. Jocelyn Ibarra was a pretty woman when she smiled, and it seemed the sun might hide its head in defeat. Perrin's father laughed softly and ruffled Perrin's curly hair. Perrin blushed very red and said nothing, but then he was shy, and he seldom said very much. "Make me fly, Perrin," Dessel said, lifting up her hands to him. "Make me fly." Perrin barely waited to sketch a polite bow to the grown-ups before turning to take his sister's hands. They moved a few steps from others, and then Perrin began to spin around and around, faster and faster, until Dessel's feet left the ground. Round and round he spun her, higher and higher in the great swoops, while she laughed and laughed in delight. After a few minutes, Mistress Ibarra said, "That's enough, Perrin. Put her down before she sits up." But she said it kindly with a smile. Once Dessel's feet were back on the ground, she clung to one of Perrin's hands with both of hers, staggering a little, and maybe not too far from sickening up. But she kept laughing and demanding he make her fly some more. Shaking his head, he bent to talk to her. He was always so serious. He did not laugh very often. Abruptly, Egwin realized that someone else was watching Perrin. Celia Cole, a pink-cheeked girl a couple years older than she, stood only a few feet away with a silly smile on her face, making calf eyes at him. All he needed to do was turn his head to see her. Egwin grimaced in disgust. She would never be fool enough to make big eyes at a boy like some kind of woolhead. Anyway, Perrin was not even a whole year older than Celia. 3 or 4 years older was best. Egwin's sisters might have no time to talk to her, but she listened to other girls enough to know. Some said more, but most thought 3 or 4. Perrin glanced toward Egwin and Celia, and went back to talking quietly to Dessel. Egwin shook her head. Maybe Celia was a ninny, but he ought to at least notice movement in the limbs of a big water rope behind Celia caught her eye, and she gave a start. The raven was up there, and it still seemed to be watching. And there was a raven in the tall pine tree, too, and one in the next, and in that hickory, and 9 or 10 ravens that she could see, and they just all seemed to be watching. It had to be her imagination. Just her. Why were you staring at him? Startled, Egwin jumped up and spun around so fast that she banged herself on the knee with her bucket. A good thing it was nearly empty, or she could have been hurt herself. She shifted her feet, wishing she could rub her knee. Adora stood up, looking at her perplexed expression in her face, but she could not be more puzzled than Egwin. "What are you talking about, Adora?" "Perrin, of course. You were staring at him. Everybody says you'll marry Randall Thor when you're older. I mean, and have your hair in a braid." "What do you mean, everybody says?" Egwin said dangerously, but Adora just giggled. It was exasperating. Nothing was working the way it should today. Perrin is pretty, of course. At least I've heard lots of girls say so, and lots of girls look at him just like you and Cecilia. Egwin blinked, and she managed to put that last out of her head. She had not been looking at him anything at all the way Celia had. But Perrin, pretty? Perrin? She looked over her shoulder to see whether she could find pretty in him. He was gone. His father was still there, and his mother with Patrum and Dissel. But Perrin was nowhere to be seen. "Drat!" She had meant to follow him. "Aren't you lonely without your dolls, Adora?" she said sweetly. "I didn't think you left your house without at least two." Adora's open-mouthed stare of outrage was quite satisfying. "Excuse me," Egwene said, brushing past her. "Some of us are old enough and have work to do." She managed not to limp as she made her way back to the river. This time, she did not pause to look at the men washing the sheep. She was very carefully did not look for the raven. She did examine her knee, but it was not even bruised. Carrying her filled bucket back to the meadow, she refused to limp. It had just been a little bump. She kept watching cautiously for her sisters as she carried water, pausing only to let someone take the dipper in for Perrin. Matt would be as good as Perrin, but she did not see him either. Drat Adora! She had no right to say things like that. Walking in among the tables where women were sorting the wool, Egwene came to a dead stop. Staring at her youngest sister, she froze, hoping Louise would look the other way for just an instant. That was what she got for trying to watch her parent, and Matt as well as her sisters. Louise was only 15, but she had a sour expression on her face and her hands on her hips as she confronted Dag Copland. Egwene had never make herself call him Master Copland, except out loud, to be polite. Her mother said you had to be polite, even to someone like Dag Copland. Dag was a wrinkled old man with gray hair that he did not wash very often, or maybe not at all. The tag hanging from the table by a string was inked to match the ear notches on his sheet. "That's good wool you're setting aside," he growled at Louise. "I won't be cheated on my clip, girl. Step aside and I'll show you what goes where, my own self." Louise did not move an inch. "Wool from bellies, hindquarters, and tails has to be washed again, Master Copland." She put just a bit of emphasis on master. She was feeling snippish. "You know as well as I, if the merchants find twice washed wool in just one bale, everyone will get less for their clip. Maybe my father can explain it to you better than I can." Dag drew his chin and grumbled something under his breath. He knew better than to try this with Egwene's father. "I'm sure my mother could explain it so you'd understand," Louise said relentlessly. Dag's cheek twitched, and he put on a sickly grin, muttering that he trusted Louise to do what was right. He backed away, and then hurried off little short of running. He was not foolish enough to bring himself to the attention of the woman's circle, if he could help it. Louise watched him go with a definite look of satisfaction. Egwene took the opportunity to dart away, breathing a sigh of relief when Louise did not shout after her. Louise might prefer sorting wool to helping with the cooking, but she would much rather be climbing trees or swimming in the water wood, even if most girls had abandoned that sort of thing by her age, and she would take her chore out on Egwene, given half the chance. Egwene would have liked to go swimming with her, but Louise plainly considered herself her own company and nuisance, and Egwene was too proud to ask. She scowled. All of her sisters treated her like a baby, even Elaine, when Elaine nosed her at all. Most of the time, Elaine had her nose in a book, reading and rereading their father's library. He had almost 40 books. Egwene's favorite was The Travels of Jane Farstrider. She dreamed of seeing all those strange lands he wrote about. But if she was reading a book and Aileen wanted it, she always said it was much too complex for Egwene. And just look at it. Draw all 4 of them. She knew. She saw some of the water carriers taking breaks to sit in the shade or trade jokes, but she kept moving, although her arms did ache. Egwene Elvire was not going to slack off. She kept watching for her sisters, too, and for Perrin and Matt. Drat Adora, anyway, drat all of them. She did pause when she neared the wisdom. Doral Barron was the oldest woman in Edmund's Field, maybe in the whole 2 rivers, white-haired and frail, but still clear-eyed and non-stopped at all. The wisdom's apprentice, Naveen, was on her knees with her back to Egwene, tending Billy Conger, wrapping a bandage around his leg. His breeches had been cut away short. Billy, sitting on a log, was another grown-up who Egwene found it hard to show the proper respect. He was always doing silly things and getting himself hurt. He was the same age as Master Luhan, but he looked at least 10 years older. His face hollow-cheeked and his eyes sunken. "You've played the fool often enough in the past, Billy Conger," Mistress Barron said sternly, "but drinking while handling wool shears is the worst playing the fool." Oddly, she was not looking down at Nevian. "I only had a little ale, Wisdom," he whined, "because of the heat. Just a swallow." The Wisdom sniffed in disbelief, but she continued to watch Naveen like a hawk. That was surprising. Mistress Barron often praised Naveen publicly for being such a quick learner. She had apprenticed Naveen 3 years earlier, and then her apprentice died of some sickness. Even Mistress Barron could not cure it. Naveen had been a recent orphan, and a lot of people said that Wisdom should have sent her to her relatives in the country after her mother died and taken on someone years older. Egwin's mother did not say so, but Egwin knew she thought it. Naveen straightened on her knees, done with fastening the bandage, and gave a satisfied nod, and to Egwin's surprise, Mistress Barron knelt down and undid it again, even lifting the bread poultice to peer at the gash in Billy's thigh before beginning to wrap the cloth back around his leg. She actually looked disappointed. But why? Naveen began fiddling with her braid, tugging it the way she did when she was nervous, or trying to bring attention to the fact that she was a grown woman now. When is she going to outgrow that? Egwin thought. It was nearly a year since the woman's circle had let Naveen braid her hair. A flutter of motion in the air caught Egwin's eye, and she stared. More ravens dotted the trees around the meadow, now dozens and dozens of them, and all watching. She knew they were. Not one made a try to steal anything from the tables or food. That was just unnatural. Come to think of it, birds were not looking at the trestle tables at all, or at the tables where the women were working with the wool. They were watching the boys herding the sheep, and the men shearing the sheep and carrying wool, and the boys carrying water too. Not the girls or the women, just the men and the boys. She would have bet on it, even if her mother did say she should not bet. She opened her mouth to ask the Wisdom what it meant. "Don't you have work to do, Egwin?" Naveen said without turning around. Egwin jumped in spite of herself. Naveen had been doing that ever since last fall, knowing that Egwin was there without looking, and Egwin wished she would stop. Naveen turned her head and then looked at her over one shoulder. It was a level look, the sort Egwin had been trying unkindly. She did not have to hop Naveen the way she would for the Wisdom. Naveen was just trying to make up for Mistress Barron doubting her work. Egwin thought about telling her that Mistress Eileen wanted to talk to her about a pie. Studying Naveen's face, she decided what might not be a good notion. Anyway, she had been doing what she vowed not to, slacking off, standing around watching Naveen and the Wisdom making as much of a curtsy as she was holding her bucket to the Wisdom. Not Naveen. She turned away. She was not hoping, and not because Naveen looked at her. Certainly not. And not hurrying either, just walking quickly to get back to her work. Still, she walked quickly enough that before she realized it, she was back among the tables where women were working wool, and face to face across one of the tables with her sister Elisa. Elisa was folding fleece and baling it, and making a bad job of it. She seemed distracted, barely even noticing Egwin, and Egwin knew why. Elise was 18, and her waist-length hair was still tied with a blue handkerchief. Not that she was thinking about getting married. Most girls wait at least a few years. But she was a year older than Naveen. Elise often worried aloud about why the women's circle still thought she was too young. It was hard not to feel sympathy, especially since Egwin had been thinking about Elise's predicament for weeks now. Well, not about Elise's problem exactly, but had been set her thinking. Off to one side of the tables, Kelly Copland was talking with some young men from the farms, giggling and twisting her skirts. She was always talking to some man or another, but she was supposed to be folding fleece. That was not why she caught Egwin's eye, though. "Elise, you shouldn't worry so," she said gently. "Maybe Barrowan and Eileen got their hair braided at 16. Most girls did," she thought. She was not all sympathy. Elise had a habit of offering sayings. "The hour wasted won't be found again. or a smile makes the work lighter until your teeth started to ache from them. Egwene knew for a fact that a smile would not make her bucket lighter by one diaperful, but Callie's 20 with her Namade coming in a few months. Her hair is not braided and you don't see her moping. Elisa's hands went still on the fleece and the table in front of her. For some reason, the woman on either side of her put their hands over their mouths, trying to hide laughter. For some reason, Elisa's face turned bright red, very bright red. Children should not, Elisa sputtered. Her face might be burning like the sun, but for all her sputtering, her voice was cold as midwinter snow. A child who talks when children who, Jilly Lewin, a year younger than Elise, in her black hair and thick braid that hung below her waist, sank to her knees. She was laughing into her hands so hard. Go away, child, Eliza snapped. Grown-ups are trying to work here. With an indignant glare, Egwene turned and stalked away from the folding tables and the bucket, thumping her leg at every step. Try to help someone, try to buck up her spirits, and see what you got. I should have told her she isn't a grown-up, she thought fiercely. Not until the circle lets her braid her hair. She isn't, and that's what I should have said. The fierce mood stayed with her until the bucket was empty again, and then she filled it once more, and then she squared her shoulders. If she was going to do a thing, then you had to do it. Heading straight for the sheep pen, she walked as fast as she could and ignored anyone who motioned for water. It was not slacking off. The boys would need water, too.